Thank you so much, Rabbi John, for allowing me to speak this morning, and for my dear sister Eve, who is on the worship team, who I know from Israel, from Zikron Yaakov. There you are, Eve. Hi. It is an honor to be here, and I want to share something from God's Word and a little bit of an update on what's going on in Israel. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 1, it says, "To everything there is a time and a season and a purpose for everything under heaven." And it goes on to talk about some of those different experiences and seasons. And you know, in the biblical and Jewish world, times and seasons are really important, because even if you go back to creation, God put the sun, the moon, and the stars as signs for seasons. And then, of course, the new moons that we're going to be celebrating, Shabbat. A young girl, when she reaches a certain age, she begins a season, a cycle, the cycles and seasons of life. And the importance of embracing the times and the seasons and going through the times and the seasons. Some of those times and seasons aren't always nice. If you look at the list in Ecclesiastes, some of them are kind of sad and negative, and there's a time for war. There's a time to break down. There's a time to weep. And the man who wrote this book, it's alleged that it was King Solomon. And Solomon, when he was a younger man, he had a dream, and God appeared to him in the dream and said, "Ask whatever you want." And remember the story? Solomon asks for a wise and a discerning heart. That's how it says it in the English. And it's not a bad translation. In the Hebrew, it's just two words, Lev Shomer, which means a hearing heart, or a heart with ears. And God said, you know, because you didn't ask for wealth and fame and riches, I'm going to give you that as well as wisdom. And at the end of his life, he's passing on some advice for us. And he kind of looks at life, he looks kind of back at life from two different perspectives, two completely different perspectives. One is he's looking at every time and season under heaven. That's what he says in verse 1. And the other perspective he uses is, he says, it's like Hevel Chavalim, which means in English, or translation, it's like chasing after the wind. It's meaningless. These are a couple of the different translations. And the Hebrew, Hevel, and pluralized, it's Chavalim. There's a number of different translations, but it's either a vapor or, and you know what a vapor is, right? It's like it's there, but it's not quite there. In fact, it's actually the name of Cain's brother. In English, we say Abel, but in Hebrew, it's Hevel. And when you think about his death, really, it was meaningless. He was there, but then he's gone. His blood was crying out from the earth. His bloods, and it's plural, because it wasn't just him, it was his children and children's children. And of course, we know the story that they both brought sacrifices. Cain and Abel brought sacrifices to God. God wasn't happy with Cain's sacrifice, because he wasn't able to bring another sacrifice. But isn't it interesting that Solomon had these two completely different perspectives? One was like, it's meaningless, it's pointless, I don't understand it, it's not worth understanding. It's like vapor. And then the other perspective, totally different end of the pendulum, he looks at every time and season under heaven, meaning ordained, or under the supervision, under the sovereignty of heaven. And like I said, there are some pretty tough seasons mentioned. There are some easier seasons mentioned. And it's not so difficult having faith in God, trust in God, and the times where there's peace, times when it says there's a time to build up. When I immigrated to Israel about 32 years ago, since that time, pretty much all I've seen is Israel being built up. And as a tour guide, I'm sitting on bus after bus, pointing out the incredible things that Israel has been able to achieve in such a short time, under fire, under persecution, 17 different wars, but the infrastructure, the roads, the water with the desalinization plants, the nuclear energy, solar energy, high tech, in the medicine area, biochemistry, science. Per capita, we have by far the most Nobel Prizes. So seeing so much being built up, but it also says there's a time to break down. And on October the 7th, I remember that day very well. It was the last day of a tour that I was guiding. They were from California. We just put our suitcases on the bus, and we were ready to finish our tour. And I got a text on my cell phone: all tour guides, immediately get your groups into your hotels and find your bomb shelters. And, you know, we have conflict all the time, but this text was very different. So I told everyone, come on, guys, we got to get back into the hotel. We get back in, and literally within a few seconds, the sky is lighting up. Missiles, drones, and then our Iron Dome interceptors. And then I'm getting texts every 5-10 minutes, every hour. And we realized we're at war. This is something very different. Then the reports came that an army, it was believed at the time that there was an army of about 4,000, but now it's believed it's more like 6,000. Heavily armed terrorists, mostly drugged up, and with lists of what and what not to do to the men, to the women, to the children, to the babies. And those first few hours and days and weeks, our nation went through a time of shock, a time of trauma, and many other words that is very hard to describe. I'm sure some of you here felt some of that shock and trauma. And especially, how could this happen with such an incredible army and military? And of course, that question is still being asked, and still we haven't really got the answers yet. But we're told that we will get some of those questions answered. But we didn't really have time to sit down and go to a counselor or a psychotherapist or a psychologist and work through this shock and trauma, because we're at war and we are fighting for our survival. And in that first week, 350,000 Israelis living abroad, they left their homes, they left their children, their wives, their work. They got on the first plane, they came back, and they came to fight for their nation. And you can clap if you want. That was a season, a time that was slapped upon us. It came from out of the blue. There had been some warnings, but they were kind of pushed away. And we're in the season of war and trauma and fighting for our survival. By the way, you may not know this, that was not the original plan from our enemies. Their plan actually was that all of the different surrounding enemies were to attack us all at one given moment. We use the analogy of an octopus with 8 different arms. Well, you, I'm sure, know that the octopus is Iran. They are doing all the funding, and the different arms are the different proxies. And their original plan was that they were going to attack us all at one moment. Do you realize how close, how serious a situation that was and still is when you think of Hezbollah up in the north, who had planned to take over military bases, kidnap in the thousands, petroleum tanks in the port of Haifa, let alone in Judea and Samaria. You've got the Islamic Jihad, the Taliban, the Houthis. And so the fact that Hamas jumped the gun, I don't want to use the word a miracle, but really we were so close. And we've been fighting. It's now 11 months of this time and season of war. And I quoted Solomon when he said, "To everything there is a time and a purpose under heaven." It's really difficult in a situation like this to accept that this is under heaven. Where was God on October the 7th? Was he blindsided? Was he asleep? Did he miss something? Or did he know this was going to happen? Big questions. A lot of people are asking these tough questions. In Genesis 34, there's a really interesting story. Jacob had a daughter called Dinah or Dinah. And it says that there was a man called Shechem who went out, he saw her, he liked her, he wanted her, and then he raped her. And when Jacob heard about it, it says he held his peace. Really interesting response to his daughter getting raped. And there's a lot of rabbinical commentary. Should Dinah have gone out by herself? You didn't do that as a young maiden, as a young girl in those days, number one. Number two, Jacob was the father. He was the responsible one. And perhaps he held his peace because, one, maybe he felt a little guilty that he was the responsible one. Or maybe he himself was traumatized by the news that his only daughter had just been raped. But he held his peace. It was the brothers, the 12 sons, they were the ones who took charge. When they found out that Shechem raped her after he wanted to marry her. So the sons, they said, yeah, that's fine, you can marry her, but if you want to, you have to be like us. You have to go and get circumcised, to which they agreed. So they went out, they got circumcised, and on the third day, it says that Simeon and Levi went out and massacred the people of Shechem. That was their response. Finally, Jacob, the patriarch, the silent one, which is very uncharacteristic, he speaks up and he's angry with his sons. And he said, why did you do this? Why did you act deceitfully? The surrounding peoples are going to hear about it. They're going to take revenge. And the brothers or the sons responded and they said, should we have allowed our sister to be treated like a whore and defiled? And that's where the story ends. It's a kind of an open-ended case story with many emotions and questions. Who was right to be? Was Jacob right in responding to his sons like that? In some ways, I think he was, because number one, they did act deceitfully, but perhaps more importantly to Jacob is now his whole family were in danger of being attacked. So in some ways, Jacob was right. But what about the brothers? Were they right in responding the way they did? What did they achieve by avenging their sister like this? Did it give them a sense of satisfaction? Maybe they did it for her because when Dinah heard about it, it gave her a sense of justice. Because there's no other mention of Dinah in this story. Because a young lady who's either defiled or raped, in that culture, that's it for them. So maybe for her, it brought a sense of healing. But this story is charged with a whole lot of questions and reactions and trauma and the way that people respond and the different levels of trauma that people can experience. And certainly Jacob, the patriarch and his response and perhaps his lack of response is because of the trauma that he was going through. And perhaps the brothers' over-response was their expression of the trauma that they went through and the shock. And I think this story, in many ways, is a kind of a small-time reflection of what our nation are going through. Because we are a nation still in trauma. I believe even our Prime Minister is traumatized. No one can see and hear what happened, and I'm not going to go into detail, without it absolutely cutting someone to the heart. Actually, I shouldn't say no one, because there's a lot of people who are not affected by what happened. In fact, they're kind of almost saying it didn't happen, but I don't want to talk about that. But we are a nation that needs healing. And the season, the time that we're in, it's a very, very difficult time. And God wasn't asleep. God wasn't blindsided. Everything is under heaven. He's the judge. And for the time being, we are fighting, we are hurting, and in a way, the fight is starting to turn. I don't know exactly what victory is going to look like. What does that mean, victory? Just as we're getting the South, Gaza, under control, we've been battling up in the north. And just when that seems to calm down, we're battling inside of Judea and Samaria, inside of the West Bank. And then, of course, the battle of the media. And you know that just as much, with the Jewish communities here coming under attack. But personally, having gone through this last 11 months, there have been times and seasons in my personal life that have not been easy. These are very difficult times to reevaluate even your own theology. And I've had letters from people saying October the 7th was a judgment from God on Israel. These were some of my friends. And I even know some people back at home who somehow kind of say there could be a bit of truth in that, but I don't agree with that. I think this is absolute evil. And it interestingly emanates mainly from Iran. Now, Iran, who were called ancient Persia, and there's a story in the book of Daniel when Daniel was praying and the Lord said, Daniel, from the moment you first started to pray, I heard you. but the prince of Persia has resisted. Now, I'm not an expert on territorial spirits and angels and demons, but it just seems that there is some kind of principality or power that emanates from ancient Persia that is still around today. And so there is something in the spiritual world going on. It is so evil. That's what I see going on. And this is a tough season because it has all kind of come out from under the ground, and it literally under the ground. We have discovered 300 miles of tunnels under the Gaza Strip. We've discovered tunnels under Judea and Samaria and also under South Lebanon. It's going to take approximately 2.5 years to destroy those tunnels in the Gaza Strip alone. And then, of course, the question is, what's going to happen to the Gaza Strip? Who is going to rule? Once it takes 15 years to clean up the mess, who will rule and reign there? And I kind of promised to myself I wouldn't get too political this morning, so I'm not going to go that direction. But the times and the seasons that we as believers go through, how do we accept them? Do we try and hasten those seasons, those cycles that we're in? Maybe sometimes we do. Remember Joseph when he was in prison and he interpreted the dreams and he said to the butler, "Remember me." And they say, some of the ancient rabbis say, God gave him another 2 years in prison for that. Because he hadn't quite, I think that's a bit hard on Joseph, but he hadn't quite come to that place of full rest, full trust. But I think what I'm trying to say, what I've learned is in these seasons, the not so much the easy, the good seasons, but the difficult ones. You know, even the times of breaking down. There's a time to be built up and a time to break down. In the 32 years that I've lived in Israel, this is the first time that I'm seeing Israel being broken down. On the borders of Gaza, whole towns and communities have been wiped out. Whole families. We're talking about 1,250 people, not to mention the many, many wounded. And then on the northern border, 100,000 Israelis have been taken out of their homes. They're living in hotels and Airbnbs. They want to go home. They want to send their children back to their schools. But it's too dangerous. And on that northern border, 30,000 acres of land has been burned. Homes have been destroyed. Many people's work is totally gone now. Families are being destroyed because of the stress. Their husbands are out in the army, and the wives, by the way. And the children, they want to see their Abba and their Ima. And the fatigue, the tiredness. And of course, October the 6th, when we had, do you remember, we had such terrible division with protests. And when October the 7th hit us, incredibly, in those first few weeks and months, we had an amazing sense of unity. We're all fighting for our survival. But sadly, there's a lot of cracks in that unity as our enemies, who are masters at guerrilla warfare and strategy, they know what they're doing and it's working. They are trying a war of attrition, which means a war to tire out the enemy. So, on one hand, learning to accept and rest in the different seasons, especially the difficult ones of breakdown, and try to learn and try to make reason of what's going on. And, you know, even as new covenant believers, I think we go through breakdowns because the promise of the new covenant is God said, I will take away your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. How is God going to do that? How is he going to take away our strong will, our stiff neck, our hearts of stone? He somehow orchestrates things in our lives out of his love to break us down. And it's kind of reminds me of when the Israelites came out of Egypt. They had they experienced that salvation. What a great season. And then they come to the desert in the book of Numbers. And, you know, when they were in Egypt, at least in some way they knew who they were. They had an identity. We're slaves. We know when we're going to get food. We know we've got a 9-to-5 job. They had a sense of security and identity, but they come into the desert and they lose all of that. And it's kind of this no man's land. They're not in Egypt. They're not yet in the promised land. And what does the Lord do with them? He starts to reshape them. He starts to, it says he numbered them by their names. Interesting phrase. He numbered them by their names individually. Then by families. And then by tribes. And then as a nation. So this is where they started to take shape. And then, of course, all 20-year-olds are called to step forward because they're inscripted into the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, or the Desert Defense Forces, whatever you want to call them. And think about it. These were farmers. These were contractors in Egypt. They didn't know anything about fighting at all. And now, whether they like it or not, this is a new season for them. They've got to step forward and become fighters. And whether we like it or not, we've got to step up. We're in a different kind of war in Israel. We're all at war. It's up here in the mind. Ours is more of a physical, but you have your wars here. And we've got to learn to fight with the spirit of our warrior, Yeshua, who lives in us. He's a warrior. We got to know that part of him. And then 30-year-olds were to step forward and become priests. And that also is our calling. So God wasn't making a mistake of the timing, bringing them out into the desert and reshaping them. And I guarantee they went through some kind of breakdowns when they got out of Egypt. The whole identity that they had from Egypt, that had to go away. That had to break down. And then God began to build them up. As I mentioned in that story from Genesis 34, it kind of ends so many questions unanswered and a real mess. There was still poor Dinah. There was still the tension between Jacob and his sons and the fear of the surrounding peoples. And that's what we're going through today. There's tensions in the way we respond and don't respond. People on the left in Israel, they want to go back to October the 6th. The people on the right, including our Prime Minister, they are saying no way until this war is won. No way until the memories of these 1,250 are somewhat sanctified. And in Exodus 15, when God brought Israel out of Egypt and Miriam and Moses are singing, one of the things they say is Adonai ish milchama. Adonai Shmo. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. And there is a kind of a weak Christianity out there. And it's taking on board the spirit of wokeness And I'm not saying that we need to go out like the sons of Jacob and try to avenge every wrong thing. This week's Parashat HaShavua, it mentions the verse, Tzedek, tzedek tirdofu. Justice, justice you shall pursue. Not always vengeance, justice. And sometimes that's not an easy thing to know how, where, when. But like I said, when the Lord brought the Israelites out, it says he brought them out as an army. And we are an army. We're soldiers. We're in a war. And one of the struggles is, on one hand, we're to accept that every season that we're in, God is in control. It's under heaven. And God, what do you want me to learn through this season, through this cycle? On one hand, we're to accept it, we're to receive it, we're to learn. On the other hand, where does prayer come in? If we're in a time of war, if we're in a time of weeping and mourning, I think there is a place, again, on one hand we accept, on the other hand, we are to be intercessors. We are to be prayers. This is the role, part of the role of a priest. So we don't necessarily accept the war how it is. We need to be active. And first we need to pray. We need to be in that zone where we pray, which is in a place of being so powerless, because we don't have the keys, we don't have the answers. That's in God's hands. But we're in that zone and we pray and we leave our prayers there, and then we've got to move on with life. We can't stay here. So some years ago, myself along with some others, we started a ministry called Light to the Nations Ministry. And it's a ministry where mainly teaching, where I teach the Parashat HaShavua each week. It's a prayer ministry. We have a Prayer for Israel meeting each week. And we reach out to the community. We go out with support, with aid. We've been able to take some finances to some of the soldiers, buy them waterproof backpacks, waterproof gloves, special helmets. There's been some children. I remember I was in Jerusalem at a refresher course. As a tour guide, we have to do a one-day-a-year refresher course. I was at the Israel Museum, and I see all these children there. So I go over, and there was a few policemen watching guard. And I said, what's going on here? And he said, all these children and families, they're from the north. They've been taken out of their homes. And this is where they are. They're living in Jerusalem. And here at the Israel Museum, we've given them a whole section where they can do it's like a set-up school. So I happen to have some money in my bag given from a couple of churches from the States here. So I got talking to the headmaster and some of the teachers, and they were telling me some of their needs, some of their struggles. So what a blessing it was to be able to say to them, I happen to have some finances from Christians who love Israel, who support Israel. You can clap, yeah. And we were able to give some, and we exchanged emails, and they wrote out a certificate from their school. It was called Adonai Oz, the Lord is my strength. And it was a religious school, and so they've got connections with this Christian church in Minnesota. But guys, I could stand up here for hours giving you stories. I was in Tel Aviv a few months ago, and I saw this huge crowd of people, and I go over, and in the middle, there were literally hundreds and hundreds of animals, dogs, cats, guinea pigs, little Tweety birds from these homes where they've been wiped out. Their owners have been massacred, and there were people looking for homes, or they had buckets asking for money that they can just give them food so that they could live. Many, many cases. That ministry that we set up a few years ago, light to the nations. It was based on a verse, Isaiah 60, verse 1, arise and shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has filled the earth. See darkness over the people and thick darkness over the nations, but the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. We have that light, everyone. We have that light. Let me just close by saying we need to discern the times and the seasons that we're in. As an individual, as a family, as a community or a congregation, as a nation. On one hand, we're to accept the season, rest in that season, but at the same time, pray into that and move on with what we've got to do in life and find places where there is darkness and bring light, and find places where there is despair. You know, there's been over 70 suicides of people who witnessed what happened at that dance on October the 7th. The images in their minds are too much. So there's a lot of despair. And so where there's darkness, we bring the light. And where there is despair, we bring hope. Thank you very much. God bless.